I'm going to talk about the order being under strain for all the obvious reasons of the war, but two aspects of the strain that the international order, the order that all of us built out of the ashes of World War II, are under for two reasons I want to talk about. One is the rise of China, and the second is the challenge of American reliability and will. I'm going to argue that the order is actually a lot more durable than we often give it credit for. And as Dr. Polyakova was just saying, that it's contingent, it depends on choices that we make. I hate this argument that President Obama always used to say that the arc of history bends towards justice, because that's only true in a narrow sense. The arc of history bends towards justice when we grab a hold of it and wrench it that direction. Otherwise, it does not. And we are acting like it's the law of gravity, and that is a self-indulgence that has brought us to the point that encouraged aggression against liberty and against our Ukrainian colleagues. I do think the war in Ukraine is an enormous test of our willingness to fight for liberty. I mean, the joyful part is seeing the catastrophic failings of the Russian military. And yet our policies are still very highly, again, as Dr. Polyakova was just saying, very highly conditioned by anxiety about being drawn into the fight itself, which is encouraging the Russians. Moreover, I think we are at risk of giving Ukraine just enough help to keep fighting and not enough help to win. And that will be both a moral and a strategic failure that we ought to be a lot more worried about than we are currently worried about. And that the end state, to answer the question you didn't pose to me, there is an end state, and it's Ukraine regaining sovereignty over all of its territory. And that in order for Ukraine to achieve that, what we are doing is not good enough. Like the Pentagon is celebrating sending 200,000 rounds of artillery to Ukraine. By my arithmetic, at current rates of Ukrainian expenditure, that's 33 days of artillery exchanges. That is nowhere near what is needed. And that the standard we should set for ourselves is we need to give Ukraine enough help that they can cut the artery of Russian resupply, because that's what's going to change the dynamic on the battlefield, make negotiations possible, and make an end state that stabilizes the international order in favor of liberty. And our challenge is to provide that support and to hang together, not to accept a frozen conflict, which is a way of saying accepting Russian success. We need to not buy into this self-indulgent sophistry. Okay, so first, the rise of China, right? We are all besotted with the rise of China. And my own government thinks it's alternatively the return to great power competition or the pacing challenge for America's national security. And we come to those conclusions because if you think the metrics are gross domestic product, military spending, volumes of trade, government research and development spending, or manufacturing output, China looms enormously, right? But those are all measures that exaggerate the role of population size. And there are, as my AEI colleague Michael Beckley argues, and he and Hal Brands have a fabulous book coming out in 2 months on the subject of what we need to do about the China challenge. Those are all poor indicators of actual power. And that if you look at geography, do you have great neighbors like Canada and Mexico, or do you have China's neighbors and contested borders? The demography of the United States benefiting so much by talented people choosing to become Americans. and the Chinese teetering on the cliff of demographic disaster because of the one China policy. Political institutions, not the greatest time to make that argument for my sweet provincial country. And yet, still, I would rather have my country's problems than China's problems if you are talking about the maintenance of power, which takes us to the last of the better metrics, which is soft power, right? As I told somebody earlier, I worked in General Powell's staff in the early 1990s and was on the team that had to host the Russian military when we had our first military-to-military exchanges. And Powell's instruction to us was, take them anywhere they want to go. And we were all wringing our hands that they were going to want to go to Offutt and look at the nuclear alert stuff. They wanted to go to Disneyland, my friends. Like, this is why free societies underestimate the magnetism and the likelihood and the endurability of the liberal order, because that attractiveness matters hugely. The last thing I will say about overestimating China's rise. Anybody know what per capita GDP in China is? I'll tell you, $16,842. That places them behind Iraq. That places them behind Botswana. That puts them slightly ahead of the Dominican Republic. We are besotted with the notion of a stampeding, successful China. And for a whole host of reasons that I'll be glad to talk about in questions, what we are actually looking at are the problems of a stalling China. And that may actually be much more dangerous to us than a successful China is. Second reason the order is under strain, what John Bew earlier today described as the rowdy democracy. And I love that, the rowdiness of democracy. That's a perfect example of my sweet provincial country. I would say that I do despair in transatlantic conversations when our European allies believe there was this mythological time when the United States was governed by statesmen rather than tawdry politicians. And, we stood astride the world as a colossus. And I have to tell you, I keep looking for that America, and I don't see it anywhere in American history, right? 1954, arguably the apogee of American statesmanship. You have the American military forcibly integrating schools in the American South. You have the McCarthy hearings going on. And you have the President of the United States having to threaten our European allies that unless they agree to the rearmament of Germany, we will have an agonizing reappraisal about whether we're going to care about European security at all, right? The United States you are looking at is actually that mythological United States. We just forget about it because we're tiresome in the present. My favorite description of America was given by a British historian in 1923, Bertha Ann Reuter, who said, Americans are a people so extreme in politics or religion or both that they could not live in peace anywhere else. And that is who we were, and that is who we are. We are a disputatious, risk-tolerant country that just had 1 million people die in a pandemic when you had vaccines that we invented freely available to the American public, and 30% of my fellow Americans won't take it. That's who we are, my friends, and that's who we've always been. So my favorite article ever written about the American foreign policy is by the journalist for The Atlantic, James Fallows. And he wrote it when he came back after being the correspondent in Beijing for 5 years. And it's about the role of the Jeremiah in American foreign policy. Jeremiah is, of course, from the Bible, always feared he was failing God, which was why he was beloved of God. And James uses that as the metaphor for American foreign policy. We're dumb, lazy, and complacent until we realize we are failing and somebody else is succeeding. And then we mobilize ourselves out of our self-indulgent lethargy and do what needs doing. Parenthetically, if you don't read The Onion, the satirical newspaper, it's the best insight into actually American culture, who we are. And 3 weeks after the September 11th attack in 2001, The Onion ran a headline saying, "Americans yearn to return to pointless bullshit." And that, of course, that's true of us. But I think what you see now in my country is the gears beginning to mesh, a realization that that we have been too inattentive to the cause of freedom, to the strengthening of the liberal international order, and we gotta get our act together because the world's proving to be a very dangerous place. Back to the soft power point, I think, we're having a big debate about China now. What we are not debating: China's a danger to the international order. China's a danger to our values, to our beliefs that people have rights and they loan them in limited ways to governments for agreed purposes. And that we actually have to do what John Bew said we had to do, which is mobilize a coalition of free countries to take concerted action to preserve an order that has produced our prosperity and our security. And by the way, has also produced the prosperity and security of our adversaries, including China. And I think we're not just focusing on China, right? There are some tiresome American pundits like Elbridge Colby who would argue that the United States should ignore Europe because Europe can take care of Europe and China's the only challenge we ought to worry about. And that's a dumb argument for 37,000 reasons. But the main reason I will tell you it's a bad argument is that it is no secret that our European allies are our closest friends in the world, the people who share our values most profoundly. And if you think any other American security guarantee is going to be reliable if the United States doesn't care about Europe, nobody's going to believe it anywhere. And so for the purposes even of the reliability of our allies, we've actually got to do the right thing for stabilizing the security of Europe, and that means coming to the assistance of Ukraine. $40 billion in American assistance, the economic innovation of pulling everybody together and sanctioning central bank assets, for example. We are probably, all of us, going to find a way to use Russian central bank assets that are in our coffers for the reconstruction of Ukraine, and well, we should. What I would say I most worry about is for security of the United States and the liberal international order, is our tendency to indulge in facile, self-indulgent nonsense. Let me just give you two examples. One is that military force cannot solve this problem, right? We say that all the time, and that's nonsense. Military force is solving this problem in the Ukraine. It will be the solution if Russia wins. It will be the solution if Ukraine wins. And we need to not blanch from that truth. Second, self-indulgent nonsense. The way we are congratulating ourselves, the American Defense Department, at the moment, just yesterday, I had somebody tell me that there's never been a logistic success like all the stuff we're sending to Ukraine, 17 flights a day. That is not enough. And so it's the wrong metric that nobody's ever done it to this standard. The right metric is the standard isn't high enough. And that, my friends, is where we come back to having to figure out how to dig into our self-indulgent societies and win the argument with my mother that she should risk her 2 grandsons for the defense of Ukraine, because sooner or later, that's where we're going to be in this.
Thank you. China is not helping its ally Russia in Ukraine. What can be said about this?
It is true. Despite the Treaty of Unlimited Friendship, China is not providing weapons or soldiers, both of which the Russians evidently asked for. And they are limiting their banks' willingness to provide loans to Russia. And it looks to me like the main reason they are doing that is because they fear the reach of secondary sanctions by the recklessness of the United States Congress, which will destroy China's ability to keep its economy growing.
Will China attack Taiwan?
I think not, for 2 reasons. First, because we are now focused on this problem, right? That the PACOM's doing war games that we lose because we're testing the limits of what we need to be doing differently. My organization, the American Enterprise Institute, has a book coming out later this month, a series of essays on what it would actually take to defend Taiwan and why we should buy it, exercise it, perform to it. So you can see the gears meshing of the United States getting serious. The second reason is that my assessment is that the Chinese leadership is actually much more risk-averse than the Russian leadership is. And what I believe I see in the pattern of Chinese behavior across the last 20 years is they will take a small step, a salami slice. They will build an artificial island and wait to see if we do anything. And then they'll put an airstrip on it. And then they'll make that airstrip militarily capable. But they do it in small increments, and we have not been doing the right things to deter their continued use, just as we had not done the right things after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014.